Welcome to Boom, where we have
biomechanics on our minds.
Boom.
Boom, boom, boom.
Boom, 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 boom.
Boom.
All right, today we are here talking with Professor Robin Queen. Robin is a professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Mechanics, and she is the principal investigator of the Kevin P. Granata Biomechanics Lab. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Us too.
Well, Robin, we are going to ask you our first question, which we love to ask people. When did you first know you wanted to be a biomechanist?
It's a great question, and I actually thought a lot about this because I wasn't sure that I had a great answer. Because I think I sort of fell into biomechanics. It was one of those things that I went to my undergrad thinking I wanted to do orthotics and prosthetics work, and then stumbled into a soft tissue lab to start with for a little while, and then ended up in a physical therapy lab doing kind of rehab-based work. So I'd say probably the sort of junior to senior year of undergrad is when I figured out, well, when I actually learned what biomechanics was, and then it was an option, and then ultimately ended up deciding that that's really what I wanted to do because it kind of brought together the interests that I had in kind of healthcare and orthopedics and sports with the kind of mechanics that I really liked to do from an engineering perspective. So.
Yeah. What was there something that initially drew you to more of orthotics and prosthetics?
I don't know what actually drew me there. I mean, when I started to try and figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, which is still something I struggle with daily, I wanted to be originally an orthopedic surgeon. And so, and then I came to realize that there was just a lot of repetition in their day-to-day and what they did, and that didn't appeal to me as much. And so I had the opportunity to go spend some time with an orthotist and kind of watch the work that he was doing, and that was really interesting to me. But ultimately, it was another one of those spaces where you were just making things. You weren't really developing and creating new things unless you had to kind of go off script for something very specific for a patient. So I think that was the draw. The draw has always been to help people. The draw has always been to improve the way that people were able to move. And again, whether that was ortho or then kind of this little foray into orthotics or now what I do now, it's always been about trying to find ways to help make people move better.
I think that was probably the most succinct answer we've ever had to that question. So thank you for thinking about it and like really being thoughtful.
Yeah, and we love to hear that. I think it's always brings us back to that theme too of why we're in it, and it's to help people move better. So it's such a nice reminder of that and something that we all share together as biomechanists. So can you tell us more about the current projects that you have going on in your lab? Can you tell us a bit about the current projects you have going on in your lab?
Sure. There's a number of projects that we're doing. One of my goals really is to allow my students to choose the things that they're passionate about and the things that they really want to do. So the projects kind of run this fairly large gamut, but it's anything that I feel like I can help them with and or find collaborators that really do have the expertise that they need to be able to do the project. But the big ones, we have some NIH studies looking at anterior cruciate ligament injuries and recovery and trying to build sort of large-scale prognostic models for determining who's at risk for re-injury when they go back into sport. And so that's a sort of a long-term project that'll take us a few years to get through. We have to collect 360 patients for that one. So we'll be at it for a bit. Luckily, we have a fantastic collaborator, Joe Hart, who's down at UNC Chapel Hill. So we're kind of splitting the numbers on that. But that's kind of the biggest one. But we're doing work with kids with cerebral palsy with a collaborator of mine up at the Neuromotor Rehab Clinic, looking at gait initiation and then also the development of some sensor technologies to help with the smaller little ones. We just purchased a Thea system, which has been great. It's going to allow us to do some fun stuff outside the lab in the field. And so I have some students that are really interested in looking at back in my history, I did a lot of work in cleats. And so we're going to go back and do some more cleat work. And just had a student who graduated who was working on looking at the stiffness of the upper of a running shoe and how that impacted performance. So we kind of run the gamut between the sport stuff and then what I consider the core of the orthopedics work that I like to do. I have another student that just finished her master's work that was looking at some questions of racial differences in plantar loading as it relates to the potential development of diabetic foot neuropathy, because it was an interest of hers, and then also research engagement in that population. So she's moving on to a PhD in engineering education. So it was a good way to kind of blend her two worlds. But we could talk all day. But there's a number of projects that are going on, but they do very much span from kind of young kids with cerebral palsy all the way up to some joint replacement work that we're still doing, and then some work in postpartum women looking at loading and load asymmetry in carrying and lifting. So a little bit of everything.
Wow. just simple.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. Yep.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And I think we as students, or I guess former students now, super appreciate being able to, figure out what your passion is, try a bunch of different things, and really go for what you actually care about versus having something that you have to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
How do you manage such a span and range of projects? Is that difficult?
I would say when I first started, it was difficult. I think I've gotten kind of used to it. I don't know that my life would feel right if I was doing one or two things. We've always had a number of projects going on. Some people say it's a little crazy. You can sort of see the board behind me. That's one of two that I use to kind of keep track of projects and where things are. And then the students give me weekly updates and things, so I kind of keep it straight. But, I think for me, I've always really struggled to find one thing and it only be one thing that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So having the variety of projects allows me to continue to challenge myself and to create collaborative groups that allow me to continue to learn as I work along with students in areas that weren't necessarily my initial passion, but are things that they really want to do. And so it constantly challenges me. And I think that's why I like having kind of the breadth of projects that we do. It's also great for the students because it allows them to see the scope of what you can do within biomechanics and that it's not just one thing. It really does go across a fairly large spectrum.
Yeah, it must help them stay motivated as well to feel like they can pursue something that they're really excited about.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss to not say I have a colleague, Sarah Arena, who works alongside me in the lab, so she does help a whole lot with some of those projects. And we recently added a postdoc to the lab. And so that's been huge for helping kind of with managing the projects and things like that. So it's definitely a team. It's not just, more recently it's become a team. Originally it was just me, but it's great to have some other people who are able to bring their expertise into the space as well to really help the students with what they want to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. We actually had seen a little bit of your work about your research on race, and we just wanted to talk about that for a minute because it's not necessarily something we get to talk about on Boom a lot. So before maybe talking about some of the findings of that project, we just wanted to talk about what the implications are for looking at differences between races, or even like this kind of expands to like looking at sensitive populations. How do you deal with those implications and think about them?
No, it's a great question. And I went into the first so I did one project quite a number of years ago, back when I was still at Duke. And that was born out of a project that already existed and some data that already existed. And then took a good number of years off from kind of doing that work, mainly because I felt like I needed to learn a little bit more before I jumped back into that space. And so I had the pleasure here and the honor of working with one of our senior sociology professors who really did help me to begin to understand how to conceptualize some of this. And it was a great experience. Dr. Hill, who's now at she's at MUSC at the moment, but she will eventually transition to a faculty. She's a postdoc now down there. Was the one that brought this back into my space as a doctoral student. As it was a passion that she had. And we had long conversations, and I said, we need to get people with an expertise in this space to help us with defining what we're going to look at and how we're going to identify different things. And he was Dr. Warney Reed is the sociologist. He was fantastic in helping me understand how to really assess race and being very careful about describing it as a social construct and understanding that it was at times a proxy for other things, and how we needed to really walk that path as we were going through that research. And we had some fantastic debates in her committee meetings. I felt horrible for her because they weren't about her project. They were really about how are we going to define race. And when you put a group of people together that span, we had an anthropologist, a sociologist, 3 engineers, and an exercise physiologist on her committee. And so
talk about team.
we had to bring them all in. But we had some really interesting conversations because there was a lot of kind of the basic science side and the engineering side that wanted to define race with a test.
It's very like systematically,
right?
I'm sure.
Yeah. Like they wanted
vectors and
they wanted some sort of test to go like yes or no, and it was fantastic having the anthropologist, Dr. Schmidt from down at Duke, and then Dr. Reed in that conversation to really get everybody to understand that it's not simple, it's not easy. So we've decided to let it be a self-identified measure, and we allow the participants to identify the racial category or categories to which they believe that they fit. And so try in every paper that we write to reiterate that it's that it is a social construct, that it has more to do with community than it does with biology necessarily, and then understanding the limitations when we're trying to write those, that often what we're measuring by looking at race is not biologic. It is something else. And again, we're at the beginning of this, at least for me, of how do we really look at this, but trying to understand it from the standpoint of what has been historically reported as racial health disparities, and beginning to understand how do we as biomechanists begin to walk into that space and say, is it really that, or is there something else? And so again, not believing that we have all the answers to this, but just wanted to start to ask some of those questions to be able to dig a little bit deeper and to understand that it is important, if nothing else, to recognize that there are differences. Some of those are based on the social construct that we're going to use or call race, but I don't think it's clear. I don't think it's an easy one, and it is challenging even in review when we get reviews back, so.
I'm sure.
Because there are all these underlying like you're saying, health disparities and other things that can be underlying these differences, and things that we might not be capturing or know that we need to be measuring. But like you're saying, the fact that there are differences. And I really liked the conclusions of your paper, which all really emphasize the fact that we need to have more diverse, racially and ethnically diverse samples in biomechanics, because you are seeing these differences. And even if they are due to some underlying factors, it still is showing that the samples that we're getting, they're too small to be able to detect these differences, first of all. And then typically they aren't very diverse. So I think those points come across really strong in those papers, and I think set up, I guess, for future work really well, and the importance for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and thank you. I think of this as where we were a few decades ago with the early sex-based differences work that we all began to do. And that took a little time for everybody to sort of figure out how, and that's much clearer in most cases. Although now, I know personally in the lab here, we've asked a lot, like how do we begin to really look even at sex, and are we looking at sex, or are we looking at gender, and how are we really quantifying that, and what does that mean? And so I've had long conversations about, well, what are we really asking people when we put them into a group? Is it phenotypic, right? Is it what we're seeing, or is it a question to them about, what was the sex assigned at birth, or how are they identifying, right? And those are different things, and therefore potentially could have an impact on the results that we get. And so trying to be very thoughtful about how we ask those questions in a way that I know I was not when I started my career. So I try and think of those on a continuum of, there's always a space we're trying to push into that we may not have all the answers for, but it's important to begin to ask the questions so that we know what else we need to do and who else we need to bring in to partner with us to begin to understand those. And so, again, had the pleasure of working with those two gentlemen, and then the project I mentioned briefly from the graduate student that just finished had a different group of people that came in to help with that one, and one was out of our vet school actually, but that's where public health sits for us, and so she's an expert in public health, and so brought her in, and then another faculty who does engineering education work, really to understand the engagement piece, because that was something that came out of the projects with Dr. Hill was, we struggled to get people for the African American cohort and understanding what that was about and why, and so that's where Julia Brisbane's project came next. Was okay, what are some of those factors that are keeping people from being willing to engage in research? And I guess I was very surprised, and that work will come out here, I hope soon, but I was very surprised that still in younger African Americans there is a hesitancy to be involved in research. I always kind of expected it in our older populations, but I did not expect it as much in a college-aged and on-campus population. So still a lot to learn about how we engage people in research and really start to get those more diverse groups into studies. So a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned still seeing that in students on campus as well, because I guess initially I would think in terms of getting to a biomechanics lab or access to that and transportation and all these other factors, but when those things are already covered but there's still a lack of engagement, I think that's really saying something and definitely a reason to investigate that more. And I don't know if you can share any of those factors or give an example of maybe one of the factors, or if it's too early, waiting for the paper to be out, then that's totally
No, I mean, I it's really Julia's work, and I will give her all the credit for that. But, I think a lot of them had to do still with historical distrust and mistrust of medical research. With Dr. Hill's project, I sort of understood it because we had some blood draws in her study, and because we were looking at some physiologic measures. Julia's study was just with an EMED plate and some surveys. So we weren't really asking them to do much in the way of anything that I would have perceived as being challenging, or would have thought about some of the concerns that have historically been there. But based on the results of some of the surveys, it does seem to stem a lot from being thought of still as guinea pigs, and as not being potentially treated equitably to their white counterparts in studies, and some of the historical things with this Tuskegee studies and things like that. So I think there's just work to be done, because it's going to be really hard for us to address some of the racial health differences that we see when there's still that mistrust and distrust. And I think that has come forward again as we've gone through COVID, and just the differences in seeking treatment and being willing to be part of that conversation. So again, still work to be done on that. And she's moving over to engineering ed, so we'll have to see who wants to take that next step on. But I'm really excited for the work she will do as a future colleague in educating our future engineers in that space. So.
Yeah, I love how you're highlighting sort of where all these different people that you're bringing into this team are coming from, like so many different perspectives, and ones that I don't traditionally think about as being part of biomechanics anthropology, right? But they're so crucial to this work. And so I'm just curious. I also want to say that I appreciate that you said we had arguments. Like, these are not easy. Like, you're acknowledging these are not easy things to talk about. Like, these are things we have to wrestle with, and I think that is hard work. And that is work we all need to be doing. So I'm curious, for those who want to be doing that work and want to start exploring things like this, do you have any advice on who to talk to, how to get started? Just from all of your experience in doing this, I think that could be helpful to hear.
No, it's a great question, and I don't know that I have I don't think there is one answer.
Right. You don't have a formula.
You don't have
There's
a
no
formula, right?
formula.
There's none of that.
Yeah.
What I would say is it's about starting conversations, and that's been something for me across my career that's been incredibly important. I always walk into a situation realizing that whoever I'm getting ready to talk to is an expert in something that I'm not. And so understanding that it's important for me to sit and listen and learn, and to continue to learn from them has always been really important. So, some of those relationships have existed for decades, and yes, I'm not old, but yes, some have been decades long, and some are new. And I think each time it's about trying to weave a story that makes sense and brings the right group of people into the room. And a lot of times it's happened different ways. I'll be very honest. Sometimes it's me reaching out and saying, I want to start this project. Do you have an expertise in this area, from a website or from whatever? Sometimes it's the students. Dr. Reed came into the space because Charisse took a course from him when she was here. And she's like, I took this really cool course on racial health disparities, which she had told me she was going to take. But I was like, oh, amazing. And I kind of wish I could go sit in the class, but he's now retired, so I cannot. But he's fantastic. So that was how he ended up with us, was she taken a class with him. And then when we started down her project, I said, can you reach out to him? I would love to sit down, the three of us, and just talk this through. I need to have a better understanding of this. I need to, so that I can explain it to my engineering colleagues in a way that they're going to be able to accept that we're not going to do a blood test or something and make a definitive decision on that.
Right.
So I think it's about being open, and it's about being a little bit vulnerable, which I know we as scientists also don't talk about, but I am completely happy to go into a room and say, okay, I don't know this. This is not my space. This is not what I do. I'm really here to learn from you. And we'll have some great conversations. Usually, the project is not solidified day one. It usually takes multiple conversations and multiple meetings to come to it. They ultimately end up being fantastic colleagues that I'll call on for other projects or other things that we have going on. So it's about, for me, it's always been about building a community. And that's what I try and get the students to see while they're here is it's really hard to do any of the work that we're trying to do in isolation. We need them. I mean, beyond the ones I've talked about, I've also had psychologists that are part of our group, and physical therapists and athletic trainers and orthopedic surgeons, and it really depends on the question we're asking. And having the right people at the table makes all the difference in the world, to be able to grapple with the things that aren't easy. So I don't know that was a great suggestion, but just being willing to go out and ask for help and start to have conversations with people, I think is the best way for me that I have found.
Yeah, openness and humility. I think those are two key
vulnerability.
things. And vulnerability. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think starting there is a great start. Great advice. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And this has been just a fantastic conversation about this, and I think one that's been different from a lot of the conversations we've had so far. So I'm sure people are really going to learn a lot from it, and really appreciate that you're so open and willing to talk about it. So thank you for that. We wanted to shift to the other area of focus in your lab, which is studying re-injury prevention in people with ACL reconstruction surgery. Before we talk about your lab's findings, we wanted to briefly talk about why people with ACL reconstruction are at such a large risk of re-injury. So recent papers have said about 30% of athletes that return to sport after ACL reconstruction experience a second ACL tear, which is pretty huge. So we're wondering if you could share a little bit more about why that happens.
I don't think we know exactly why that happens. So that's a lot of the work that's being done in that space. Right now. But, I think a lot of it has to do with the way we think about rehab and recovery. And again, a lot of this is just my sort of thoughts on this, is not based in research at this moment. But, we focus a lot on the knee, specifically the one that was injured. And we don't really look holistically at the individual. Some people do, some people don't. But when we look at the return to sport metrics that are used by our surgeons, they aren't usually based in a metric that can be measured. They're usually like time or, how the person feels, or a whole host of things. There are no set criteria, especially that are put out by the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. So it's kind of a moving target.
Wow.
And so different surgeons will release at different times and for different reasons.
Wow.
I have my biases in what I think are driving the re-injury rates, which is why our research kind of goes down the path that it does. But, I think there's definitely a psychological component to it. We and others have reported on kind of this fear of movement and fear of re-injury. And that seems to be very true, especially of our younger athletes, even though they won't come out and say it. But when you give them a survey, the answers that they will give you will indicate that they are still a little bit apprehensive about being hurt again. And I think the other challenge that we're faced with is that re-injury rate isn't just on the ACL that was previously torn and reconstructed. So that is either the one that's been injured, or it's the contralateral side. It's the other leg. And so it's a little bit of a question of, and why I have gone after the questions of symmetry is because there seems to be an imbalance. And for decades, they've been talking about the imbalance in the quad hamstring ratios and all the other stuff that we've looked at, but that doesn't inherently explain why we have this differential on which side gets re-injured. And so there's a lot of people that are working on trying to quantify the why in that. And there's a few different theories. There's not a whole lot of large scale work in that space. I think the largest study that was done, I don't know, there's like 40 participants or so, and 13 or so had a re-injury, right? So you're not talking about a huge number of people. And I think that there's a difference in somebody who re-injures that's what we would call an adolescent, so up to sort of 18 to 21.
Well, I think all of those different factors make so much sense, and to me, I, knock on wood, have never had an ACL injury, but I can imagine the fear and like a lot of those psychological factors around. I mean, I'm a pretty clumsy person, and I even if I've fallen in one place, I think about being careful in that place. So I can't imagine, then returning to your field or your sport and having to relive those same types of motions and things like that without having any of that fear. But I'm wondering, sort of on the other side, what discoveries have y'all made in the field that you can, maybe give to some of our listeners that might help who have had an ACL reconstruction and help them safely return to sport? Maybe not, obviously they've got a whole team of people and orthopedic surgeons and people giving them recommendations, and I understand it can be personal, but are there any general pieces of advice that you've come to, or any data that could just help give some understanding?
Well, I guess what I'll say is that this will probably be a compilation of things that not just we have discovered, but sort of globally where the field sits at this point. From everything that's out there, what we can, I think, fairly clearly say is that for the most part, which patients don't want to hear, they need to wait longer than they historically have been to go back to sport. 6 months really isn't long enough. It needs to be more like 9 to 12. And again, that's hard when you're a teenager to think about that. But there's some work that's been done, not by us, but by others, looking at the healing of the graft itself and how stable it is and how long that actually takes. And it takes a little while to do that. I think obviously as long as you can stay in rehab and be compliant with the therapy that you're being asked to do, I think compliance has been one of those things that I've struggled with, even in our clinical trials work, is getting people to be compliant with the exercises. Again, we don't have definitive answers on exactly what, but I do believe that side-to-side symmetry is going to play some role in the re-injury, and therefore them being asymmetric is a problem. I think there's definitely a psychological component. Sorry, I'm going to cough. So I was just going to let you know that you can take that out. Oh,
thanks.
Okay, so
that's super helpful.
So I think that really taking the time to rehab well, and then ultimately I think the goal for us anyway is to get the surgeons to understand that we need to have objective measures that we can use that can be tested in the clinic, not necessarily bring everybody into a 3D mocap lab, but but be able to
Yeah.
assess their readiness to return with something other than just time itself.
Right.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It is hard compliance is hard generally, and then when you add another 6 months onto that, I could imagine that it is really difficult to hear that, especially as a teen when that time is so critical, for the future of your career in that sport potentially. So, but then thinking about it more long term, if you re-injure that one or tear the other one, then that's making it compounding the effects. So
and it's hard at that age to explain that long-term piece.
Right.
We know
absolutely.
that those patients, even with just one, are more likely to develop early onset osteoarthritis. So then you're talking about, at the age of 40 or so, needing a knee replacement. Like there are consequences, but at 14, 15, you're not thinking about what life is going to be like at 35 or 40.
No.
So,
right. You just want to be back out there playing your sport and with your friends, and that's really tough. But I think that like you're saying, the more that we're learning and the more that we have objective ways to measure that, maybe that's even easier to explain to someone too. It's like, well, we need to get this score up to here, and you're here, and so we'll have to do these exercises or do this type of therapy, and we can get you back up to that level in more of an objective way. But something that also came up with this project that you mentioned at the beginning is that you're starting a pretty huge project with 300 or 400 athletes. And when you said that, I was just like, wow, this is, especially that it seems like these assessments will probably be in person. It sounds like, to me, it feels very overwhelming to tackle such a large and long-term project. And I'm really curious about your thoughts on approaching that, and how you can, I guess, think about such a big project in a way that feels more manageable, or it feels more encouraging to be able to handle something so big.
That depends on the day you ask me that question. Some days it feels overwhelming. I think, honestly, the numbers, as they always do, came out of power analyses, right? That's what we needed to do to power the study and the way we wanted to look at things. Having a fantastic collaborator and making it a multi-center study makes it feel a little easier, although there's complications with running any study at 2 sites or 3 or 4 or whatever.
Right.
I think the thing for me that has helped is having a fantastic collaborator who I've worked with, and we share a similar ideology on where we're heading and what we're looking for. But then also having run some clinical trials has helped understanding kind of the patient components. The one saving grace for me for this one is we see them once in person, and then after that we track them for 18 months, but that's all done via survey and using REDCap. So yes, there's some chances of missing time points and all of that we deal with statistically, but we also break it down monthly. So there's a monthly enrollment target that we hope to hit. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And that's always tough. And ACLs, for better or worse, are sort of cyclic in when they happen during the year. So we know certain times are going to be more, we're going to be busier than others in terms of the recruitment and enrollment. But I think it's a challenge, and I think it's important in order to move the field forward to have a large enough sample to really begin to say, what's really happening here, and are we going to get the number of, and I always hate saying this, but are we going to get the number of re-injuries that we need to really create the predictive algorithm that we have to move this forward? But so yes, unfortunately, people have to get hurt in order for this to really play out, which always feels bad when I have to say it, but it's the reality of being able to understand the underlying mechanics that are leading to that second injury.
Right. And hopefully your research will help the future future participants not get hurt,
hope,
future athletes, I should say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that number will overall
goes down, we hope. Yes.
Exactly. Exactly. And I loved how you opened this question with, well, it depends on how you, the day you ask, which I think kind of gets to our next question of Can you tell us about a time, when you feel like things were not going right or you failed, you could call it that, and just what you learned from it, how you moved on from it, how you changed your mindset or, adapt?
A fantastic question, and one I try not to think about often, and it's important to think about. I would say, specifically in higher education, I can't speak for my colleagues in industry, but in higher ed, failure or lack of success or whatever word you want to use for it is kind of part of the deal. It's part of what we do on a daily basis. The paper's not accepted, the grant's not funded, the class I taught did not go quite how I planned, right? Like it's part of the cycle, and it's hard. I'm not going to deny that there are days that you're like, man, is anything going to go right? Am I ever going to get past this? I think for me, and people have been around me enough know, when things like that are going wrong for me, it's typically when you find me running somewhere, because that's how I clear my head. And I typically run by myself, which is also something that people don't get. Yeah. But it's just, you have to find that thing that allows you to kind of recenter and put it into perspective. Yeah. Sometimes it's, I have 2 kids. Sometimes it's, hey guys, we're going to go, in the summer anyway, we're going to go hang out at the pool for the afternoon. I just need a break. I need to reset. Like, this isn't working. Sometimes it's sitting down with colleagues and talking it through and going, okay, what am I not seeing? What is going wrong? Why isn't this grant funding? Can you read this for me? Can you take a look at, what I said, or this paper isn't getting right? So really having a community that you can rely on, I think, is huge, because doing it completely by yourself is unrealistic. There is too much of sort of disappointment, failure that comes with this, that if you don't have that sense of community there from family, from friends, from colleagues, I think it becomes really challenging. I probably cannot pick out one for you that was particularly bad, but there have been a number, all the way back to grad school and since, again, I think it's a daily or weekly thing. I mean, there's something that doesn't work quite right. I have a schedule every day that sort of falls apart, usually by about 11 o'clock. So right, it's about being flexible and figuring out kind of what are the little things that I can say, okay, I did this today, and therefore today was a success. And that's how I've had to start to frame kind of my day-to-day is, okay, so I had this list of things. If I get through 4 of them, I'm going to call today good. Sometimes that's like, I got up and I got to work, and everybody, like, projects move forward. Maybe it wasn't exactly what I wanted to accomplish that day, but something got done. And so sometimes I just think back on the day and I'm like, okay, what actually happened? And sometimes it's not with work. Sometimes the little win for me is like, hey, I got up and everybody at the house actually got something accomplished. Like, something went good with the kids at school, right? It may not be me. It may be something external to me, or one of my former students will call and say, hey, I just got this grant. Okay, when? I'll take that. That wasn't my success. That was their success, but it's still enough to go, okay, look, things aren't all bad, right? Like, there's always something that you can find that's positive in a situation. But yes, I will often go out and run when I get really frustrated. So that's usually my go-to. But everybody has a different thing that works for them. I have colleagues that are like, you will not find me running unless something's chasing me. So that's not their thing, but to each his own, right? You gotta find that thing.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah, and I think I appreciate your point that it's personal, although I think Hannah and I can both relate to exercising and running to clear your head. But I like your point about just finding things to celebrate, and I think this also goes kind of in parallel with just being grateful for the things that are going well. And I think I like that you think outside of work too, like maybe if things didn't go the way you're expecting at work, but just thinking about the bigger picture. And I think this changes for me day to day too, where if like things at work aren't going well, I'm like, okay, what is the bigger picture? What are the other things going on in my life that are going well? But when work is going well, trying to take the time to appreciate that these things are going well and feeling excited about it. So being able to sort of like refocus to what's like best serving you in the moment, I think is kind of one of the takeaways I was hearing from what you were saying.
Absolutely.
Well, we really loved hearing about some of your work today. You're doing work on so many amazing other topics. If people wanted to follow you and learn more about your work, what is the best way to do that?
depends on how good I'm being on Twitter, but there's always Twitter. Both the lab and then I have a personal Twitter that's out there as well. So both of those are options. The lab has a website. I'll be very honest and say it's not always kept exactly up to date. Because websites, I don't know, they're harder for me than like Twitter or Facebook or anything like that. Last year the students created a Facebook page, but I have not actually been keeping up. I don't know if they're posting things to it. So I would say Twitter is probably your best bet with things that are coming out and the work that we're publishing. I tend to try and get it out through those channels, and usually it'll come out through me or through the lab. The lab Twitter is probably the easiest way. I mean, there's always LinkedIn and all the other things, but Twitter's probably the best.
Okay, yeah, we'll add those to the show notes so people can easily find you in the lab on Twitter. And then for our last question, what are you most excited about for the future of biomechanics?
Oh, that was a tough one. I think that there's a lot, honestly. Every time I go to a meeting now, I was at the American College of Sports Medicine 2 weeks ago or whenever that was, and was having a conversation with some colleagues about how I think one of the things that really excites me is watching the science that's being done by the younger. I hate calling myself old, but I keep feeling like I am. But by the students, by the early career faculty, and some of the really cool ideas. I mean, I think things like markerless motion capture are going to be game changers in what we're able to do and how we're able to collect data. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in wearables. We may get there someday in a way that's, valid and reliable. I think there's so much that we can begin to do with integrating with our colleagues across different areas. We have not historically done great at engaging, our exercise physiology colleagues and some of the others. So I think that's what's really starting to excite me, is watching people begin to bring in kind of the differing perspectives and really starting to ask some questions that, because we didn't have the technology years ago, we weren't able to ask and answer. And so I love going to conferences and listening to talks. Now I don't often get to go to a meeting and that be the only thing I get to do, but when I have the opportunity to sit in a session, I'm incredibly impressed with the work that's being done by students and junior colleagues or younger colleagues. Not even junior, I hate that term, but newer career faculty, not old people like me, but people who are just starting out and are really asking some fantastic questions. So I think it's a merging of those two, of kind of the technology advances and the great questions that people are asking.
I think that's really sweet to hear from our perspective too, because I think as through grad school you're going to conferences and sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating to share your work, but knowing that there's professors and people who are listening who are excited by what you're doing and want to hear about it and want to learn from it and get new ideas and new perspectives, and I think that helps also sort of reframe the importance of having the confidence or courage to go to a conference and present and share your work and get feedback too, and how it can spark new ideas with other people in the field. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just think to echo Melissa's point, like sometimes I think if I'm at a conference presenting and I see people that I know in the field, big names in the field, then I'm like, oh no, what are they going to think of this? That helps that they're excited too by it, and excited just to see people, sharing their work, even if it's not something directly related to what they do, just it's excitement about, the field and, I think it's exciting to see people passionate about what they do, whether or not that's directly in my area or not. I think it's just great to see people loving what they do and being willing to share it. I think it's fantastic. And that's what I love about going. And I love at conferences seeing, groups of people just sitting down and kind of just talking about science. And again, we haven't been able to do that for a few years. So the last few meetings that I've gotten to go to in person have been great to just see people beginning to talk and really collaborate around science again, and how we kind of can move the field forward together. So that's been a lot of fun, and I hope that that's where we're going. Right, it's just a space where collaboration becomes kind of the norm instead of the thing that we all are like, oh, but my idea, I need to keep it here, and I can't share it. Like I'd rather see us move in the direction of
of being willing to share where we are and what we're thinking about to move the field forward.
Yeah.
That's one reason we love Boom, and I think one reason we were inspired after, we were like, how do we do this? And like, we feel so lucky to get to talk to amazing people like you. So really, thank you so much for sharing your stories, your experiences, your perspectives, and all the amazing work that you're doing.
Well, thank you guys. It's a fantastic opportunity for me, and it's been a lot of fun. So thank you for inviting me. It's been great.
Biomechanics off our minds.